Washington, but it was before publishers and editors of newspapers and magazines, and he gave a speech that was called "The President and the Press." And what he said was, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are as a people inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Now, I think it's fascinating that 2 weeks after Congress and the White House received this report, basically talking about possibly covering up artifacts if you discover them, that he thought it was important enough to go before the press, the assembled press, and say, you know what, we shouldn't have secrecy, we shouldn't have cover-up, and we're opposed to secret societies. Well, what are the SS and the Masons and the magicians if not secret societies? So he seemed to be firing a shot across the bow saying, you know what, we really shouldn't keep certain things from the public. Now, a little over a month later, he went to Congress and made his famous speech and said we should put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth in this decade, as I recall. That was on May 25th, 1961. Now, what most people don't know is that a month later in Vienna, same picture Richard found, that really torqued me off. A month later, Kennedy and Khrushchev met in Vienna, and Kennedy offered to have a joint space program with the Russians to Nikita Khrushchev, who turned it down. He turned it down because at the time the Russians were ahead in the space race. He didn't really need Kennedy. He made the offer again in 1962, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, because he thought it might be a good way for them to come together, the two countries, to sort of make peace and try to resolve the differences to avoid getting to the brink of nuclear destruction once again. Again, he was rejected, but then on the third time, on September 20th, 1963, he once again proposed it, this time in front of the entire world. The previous two proposals had been secret. This one was absolutely public at the United Nations. He said, finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among those possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. So he went public. Now, obviously, this was not too popular with certain people, like Congressman from Texas, who had all the funding for Apollo. It basically went nowhere. It went nowhere for a month. It was as politically dead as anything could be. The Russians, in fact, didn't respond at all publicly or privately. And again, at the time, this is just an example. This is a cartoon that came out, you know, Kennedy and Khrushchev stuck in the rocket going to the moon, and Khrushchev saying, I was afraid something like this would happen if you kept talking about it. So, how do we know all this is true, if these were secret meetings? Well, because Nikita Khrushchev's son says so. He says, Sergei Khrushchev says that not only did they make the offer twice secretly to his father, but on the third occasion, his father decided that maybe he should accept Kennedy's offer, given the state of the space programs of the two countries in 1963. Now, what he meant was, by then the Soviets had fallen behind. The United States had rocketed ahead, to use a bad pun, and it really would have been to their advantage to do it. Now, the time frame of this acceptance is, according to Khrushchev, late October or early November of 1963. That's, well, you know, basically 2 or 3 weeks before John F. Kennedy was killed. Now, one of the last things he said in that interview is, I think if Kennedy had lived, we would be living in a completely different world. In other words, a world where the Soviet Union and the United States would have stopped competing, stopped fighting against each other, and learned to cooperate through this joint space program. I agree with him, and I think that is the root of the problem. And that's why Kennedy was dead less than a month later. We all know the story. He was killed in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, and there's arguments back and forth whether there was a conspiracy or whether there wasn't. I've gone back and forth myself on it. Sometimes I read stuff that convinces me there was. I read stuff that convinces me that there wasn't. But it wasn't until I read this that I became convinced that Kennedy was gone, was murdered, because somebody wanted to get rid of him. This is National Security Action Memorandum number 271. I got it off the JFK Library website. Anybody can go and pull this down. In fact, you can pull down better copies. And without going into the detail or boring you with reading it, what it says is it instructs James Webb the director of NASA, to begin the process of cooperation with the Soviet Union, to set up an office and start transferring information. In other words, start giving them our technology, start telling them what we know, start sharing information. Now, given the political climate, that everything was very negative and against this politically, why would Kennedy take the incredible political risk of setting up this office after the response from Congress was basically, forget it? Now, the only way that he would have had the assurance of sticking his neck out politically would be if somehow he already had Khrushchev's agreement. He must have already known that Khrushchev had agreed. There must have been some communication, because otherwise he would never have issued this directive to start. President, he doesn't do that. You don't do that unless you've actually got an agreement with the foreign leader to go forward. The date of this is November 12th, 1963, 10 days before Kennedy was killed. Here's the second page with his signature on it. It's authenticated, there's no question about it. There's also another memo dated the same day. This was found by Dr. I think it was Ryan Wood and his son, who run a website called the Majestic Documents. Now, they got started with this whole Roswell crash, MJ-12 UFO documents controversy that emerged. They found a whole bunch of documents from various sources. They've been given some documents by other sources that are questionable. But they have this document on their website, which is also dated November 12th, 1963. It's considered top secret, and this is only part of it. It's bigger than that. But what this essentially says is, not only has he directed James Webb to begin opening this office and sharing technology with the Russians, he's now telling the director of the CIA to start telling them all of our information about UFOs. To make a clear distinction between the knowns and the unknowns in the event the Soviets try to mistake, it's interesting, our extended cooperation for cover for intelligence gathering for their defense and space programs. So, to my mind, either one of these things would have got him killed. If there was a cabal inside NASA, if there was somebody inside there who knew, von Braun and James Webb and these people who knew what was really going to be found out there, you have a president who's been committed since 1961 to sharing all of this information with the public. You've got a report, the Brookings Report, which says, don't share any information with the public because you'll destroy society. And I think they were fine with Kennedy's wacky ideas until it became a real distinct possibility. So to my mind, this memo does not have to be authentic, although it might be. They consider about 80% this is an authentic memo. So who knows? The problem that I had then is, okay, at this point, I believed that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone and that he was a nut. And there is still that possibility. But I also remembered a program I'd seen back in the 1990s, I think early 1990s, called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And there is some acoustic evidence which is disputed about whether there was 3 or 4 shots fired in Dealey Plaza that day. If there are 4, obviously there's 2 gunmen, there's a conspiracy, but there really hadn't been any visual evidence. Well, what they showed was some film. This is a clip from a film called the Marie Muchmore film. She was filming. This is the babushka lady, who was one of the ladies there that was taking film. She claims she was taking a picture of the president, a bunch of pictures right up to the point where she saw him be shot in the head. And she had pictures of the grassy knoll itself, and she was requested to turn her camera over and her film. She did. She never saw it again. So that's her claim. This is Mary Moorman. She was also taking photographs at the time, and she took a picture just a split second before this particular frame grab. Now, this is a little gruesome, and I don't really want to go into this too much, but this is a picture, another close-up, and you can actually see Kennedy slumped over. Jackie is next to him. And you can see, again, the fidelity's not great. On my computer, you can clearly see that this is a red spray of blood. You can see his hair line is lifted in the front.